Let's look at working with files more in depth. Specifically, we're going to look at ways we can view, create, and edit files from our Linux terminal. Some of these commands you may have seen me use briefly in other videos as I was teaching some different concepts or examples. Now we do want to expand on that here just a bit. First up, let's look at the concatenate command. We use the shortened version of this command in the terminal as cat. So we'll say cat, and this is mainly used to preview text file content. However, we can also use this to create new files and to edit those as well. Before we do that, let's change into our home/kali/documents directory and then hit enter. And if we say ls, you'll see that this directory is empty at the moment. So what we want to do here is we will use concatenate or cat, in other words. Then we will use the greater than sign followed by the file name that we want to create. In this case, I'll make that file.txt. Now, when I hit enter, you see that the terminal blanks out. This is actually waiting for us to enter any text that we want to be inside of this new file. So we'll just say text content and we'll hit enter to create a new line break. And we can continue to populate that as we choose. Once we're finished, we want to hit Ctrl D to break out of that. And when we do, we're brought back to the terminal. Now, if we say ls, you'll see that the file text has been created inside of this directory. If we want to view the content of that, we can again say cat, followed by the file name, which is file.txt. It's going to display our very simple file content, and that's displayed directly into our terminal output. Another command we've looked at briefly is the touch command. This lets you create single or multiple files, and that creates files without any content, or in other words, an empty file. You can also perform the touch command against an existing file if you want to just modify the timestamps of that file. So let's just say touch file1.txt and we'll hit enter. If we use our list command, we see our file.txt and file1.txt. We can do the same thing if we want to create multiple files. So I'm going to arrow up and I'm going to say touch file2.txt, file3.txt. And if I hit enter, you see that it did allow me to create multiple files at the same time. And if you use our list command again, it shows all of those. We can also use something called the standard redirect command to create a file by using simply the greater than sign followed by the name of that file. So I'll say greater than sign stdred.txt. I'll hit enter. We'll do a list command, and we do see that now inside of our directory. The interesting thing about this command is that we can redirect things that are returned back to our terminal output into a text file. So if we look, let me take this off. If we look at the content of our list command, you'll see file1, file2, file3, file, and stdred.txt. We can use our redirect command to write this output that we see from our list command into our own text file. We can do that by saying ls greater than, and I'll call it stdred2.txt, and I'll hit enter. And that actually is going to write the output of the list command into that new text file, stdred2.txt. If we use our concatenate command again to take a look inside of that, if you say concatenate stdred2.txt and hit enter, now we see all of those files that were available in our list output have been written into this text document. The content of that file does indeed include everything from the list command output. Another tool we can use is called Nano. I'll clear this off once again. Nano is a text editor pre-installed on most Linux distros. We can check to see if that is available to us by saying nano --version. And in fact, we do have version 5.4 installed here, as I would have expected. And so we can create a new file with Nano by saying nano followed by the file name. I'm just going to make that nano.txt, and I'm going to hit enter. And once we do that, notice that a new window is presented to us, our new editor. This is the Nano editor that has been opened, and we can write and edit our file directly here in the terminal. And I'll just put some text content in there. Once we're finished, you'll notice along the bottom, we have different key combinations that are going to allow us to save this and to exit. If I say Ctrl+O, you see that listed here as write out, or in other words, save. So I'll say Ctrl-O, and then it asks me what file name I want to use. I want to use nano.txt, the name that I've already given it. I'll hit enter, and now it has been saved. I can hit Ctrl-X to exit, and it's going to take me right back to the terminal. If I say list, we do see our nano text file. If I say cat nano.txt, it's going to display the contents that we put in there through our nano editor. Another popular editor is called the VI editor. We can use that by saying vi followed by the file name. I'm going to make that vi.txt, and when I hit enter, we again get an editor similar to what we saw with the nano editor. But this one is a little bit different. If we want to insert a new line, we actually need to press the letter I. Once we do that, you'll see that at the bottom, the word insert came up. So I'll say this is a VI file. I can hit escape, which will stop the file insertion. If I want to write with this, I need to use the command :W and hit enter. You will see we're now told at the bottom, vi.txt was written. If we want to exit, we need to enter :Q and then press the enter key, and that's going to take us back to our terminal. So VI is a little bit less intuitive because you have to know the commands that are available to you. If we say ls, we do see vi.txt listed here. Let's cut that, and we do see our content. I don't use VI that much because I find it to be a little less intuitive than something like Nano. One other tool I'll show you is called gedit. Now, gedit isn't built into Kali Linux by default any longer. It used to be, but they removed that from recent versions. So we do have to actually install that. And that's something else that I'll touch on here, how to actually install a package from the terminal. In order to install packages in Linux, we use the command apt install. apt meaning Advanced Package Tool. You become very familiar with this command when you do start installing packages in Linux or in Kali. Before we do that, we need to preface that with the sudo command. I'll say apt install followed by the package name, which in this case is gedit. I'm going to hit enter. We're going to be prompted for our password. We'll enter that and hit enter, and you can see the progress. It's telling me the disk space that's going to be used. It asks me if I want to continue. I can hit enter to continue that, and that should complete fairly quickly. You can see the progress here. So very simply, that's how we install packages. Looks like that is all completed now, so I'm going to clear that off. And now that we're all done, we can use gedit by saying gedit. I'll make a file called gedit.txt. I'm going to hit enter, and this actually opens an external notepad editor that we can save our notes in here outside of the terminal. We're spoiled for choice here. Lots of different ways we can do the same thing on Linux. The tool you want to use is really completely up to you. My tool of choice is typically either Nano or gedit, both of which I use to create text documents and scripts. You have lots and lots of ways to do that. I just wanted to show you many different options of that. So feel free to use whatever you find is most intuitive for your purposes. Let's now take a look at users in Linux. You have seen me create a new user before, but I do want to expand on that and explain it just a bit more. So here in our terminal, if we say sudo add user, and let's make the username Bill this time, we can hit enter. It's going to ask us for our password, so I'll enter that. And then you can see it goes through the process of creating both a new user and a new group, and both of those are named Bill. As I mentioned previously, Linux will create a user group for any new user that you create, and it will assign that group the same name as the user. You can of course change that, but that's the default action. We can give this new user a password, and we need to retype that to confirm that. It's going to ask us for some personal details. I'm just going to hit enter to blank those out. I don't need to put any of those in. Now it wants us to confirm if the information is correct. I will enter Y, and we are finished. We have a new user created. As I previously talked about, we can view the sc/shadow file to verify user creation. Let's say sudo cat/sc/shadow. If we hit enter, we see that in fact at the bottom we do see our newly created user here named Bill. One thing I'll point out that we didn't discuss before is that these usernames that we see, such as Bill, they also contain the password for this user account as well. That's what this really long value is here at the end. This password has been hashed in order to hide the password. However, there are tools that we can use to break that hash depending on the strength of the password. That can be useful to know down the road. And that's why this sc/shadow file is important. It can give us information about certain accounts. Even knowing the account usernames from here gives us at least a little bit of information. We have a valid username if we're trying to use a password attack. So now that we have this new user created, we can switch to that user easily by saying su, which is short for switch user, followed by the username Bill. I'll hit enter. It's asking me for the password. I'll enter that, and you see that our terminal prompt has now changed. We're now under the new user account. From build account, let's also try to view our SC shadow file. So we'll cat SC shadow, and you see that it's asking for our password. I'll enter that, and notice what it tells us. Bill is not in the sudo as file. This incident will be reported. Sounds really serious, right? And so what's happening here is Bill doesn't have sudo permission. We can also verify this by saying sudo-l. And when I say this, that's going to ask for Bill's password. I'll enter that. And of course, Bill cannot run sudo on Kali. We get the exact same type of message. This is an important point. When you create a new user or if you obtain access to an existing user in Linux, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can run high-level commands. The user has to be a part of the sudoers group in order to perform more restricted actions. One way that we can see users who do have sudo permission is to use getEnt commands. That's short for getEnt entries, and this will pull entries from a database for us. So we can say getEnt, and we want to do that from a group, and that group name is sudo. When we do that and we hit enter, notice that we have an X in place of our password. We have a sudo user group followed by an X. We have a 27. That is just a predefined group ID number for sudoers in Linux. And after that, we have a list of users who have sudo permissions. The Kali account is the one that I have been primarily working inside and which has sudo permission. And we have a user simply named user. I can also use my list command to see that with some optional parameters. So if I say ls-la etc/sudoers and we hit enter, this is going to present the users allowed to access the sudoers file. Or in other words, which accounts can actually add users to the sudoers group. Notice the permission that we see here. We only have read permissions for the root user and any other user that is in the root users group. No one else has any access. In fact, if we say cat etc/sudoers and we hit enter, we are also told that permission is denied. So let's use the concept that we already learned to switch into the root account here. I'm going to clear off our terminal output just to give us a little space here. Now let's try to switch into this root account. Let's say switch user. Remember, the dash will get us to the root account. It's going to ask for a password, but this is going to fail because remember, this account doesn't have sudo access. If we try to say sudo switch user to root, it's going to ask for Bill's password. Again, we're told Bill is not in the sudoers file. So I'm going to have to first switch into my main Kali account before I can do this. Now, notice I'm under the Kali account, and now I can sudo switch user to the root user, and that works just fine. You see how some of those permissions work. Now that we're under the root user, we can actually edit our sudoers file. So let's use one of our file editors. I'm going to say nano, because I want to edit this file, and I want to edit etc/sudoers. I'll hit enter. And once we hit enter, you see that we're able to now view this sudoers file. Down here towards the bottom, let me scroll down to that particular area. You can see the user privilege specification. And at the moment, we only have the root user listed here. So if we want to edit that, we can simply create a new line and we can add new users into our sudoers file. So I'm going to add the username Bill, and I'm going to just copy the rest of these permissions exactly as they are on the root account. So all. Now we've added Bill into this group. Let's save by hitting Ctrl O, which is write out. The same thing as save. It asks us where we want to write this file to. I'll hit enter, then Ctrl X to exit. Now you want to be really careful when you are altering that sudoers file. You could easily break something. Make sure that you have everything exactly correct before you do save that. So now let's switch back to the user account Bill. We'll say SU or switch user Bill. Now we are under the Bill account. Now let's see if we can view our sudoers file. So cat/etc/sudoers, and again we see permission denied. That doesn't work. And that's because we didn't add the sudo command. So we still do have to do that. So we'll say sudo cat/etc/sudoers. And if we hit enter, it's going to ask us for a password. And then it does display our sudoers file. So that's how we can alter sudo permission for users. One last thing I want to point out on users. If you have the need to delete users at all, I'll break out of here and I'll show you how we can actually do that. Let me switch to another user. I'll switch back into my Kali account. Give that password. So now we're under the Kali account. Clear this of a bit just to make some room. And if we want to delete a user, let's say sudo user del, that's the command we want, which is short for user delete. And we can follow that with the username. One of the users we saw earlier in our users list was John. So we can delete that user with this command. Now, if we enter it exactly like it is here, it will not remove the user's home directory. That's the action in most Linux distros. In order to remove the home directory, if we want to get rid of that file structure for any user as well, we need to include -arrow between user delete and the user's name. That will remove the home directory. Let's go ahead and hit enter. And it tells us that John's mail spool was not found, so there was nothing related to that. That did take care of our user. That deleted the user John. Now that we've looked at some ways to navigate our file system and also to manipulate permission and users, I want to explore some common network commands. These are going to be things that you will use over and over. I want to cover some of the basic and most useful ones. First and foremost, one of the ones I use most frequently is a command to view the configuration of my network interface adapter. If you're a Windows user, you might be familiar with the command ipconfig, and that same function in Linux is actually ifconfig, short for interface configuration. So if we perform that command and hit enter, we're going to see this displays information about our system, about our Ethernet adapter. In my case, we have a couple of adapters. We have an Ethernet adapter listed as Ethernet 0 at the top, and we have our loopback adapter as well. Now, we've looked at this concept previously in our section on networking basics, particularly IP and MAC addressing. So I won't rehash that completely. But again, we can see IP addressing, both IP version 4 and IP version 6. We also see our MAC address for our adapter listed here as well. And we see information about transmitted and received packets along with errors and drops. Additionally, we can use the command IPA and we can hit enter, and that will present some of the same information, but it's sorted a bit differently and is color coded. So maybe you may prefer that for readability. You notice we don't get information about received or transmitted packets, but we are most likely not looking for that information anyway with this command. Another one we might use is the simple route command. So I hit route and hit enter, and this is going to allow us to see what's called the routing table inside of Linux. If you have familiarity with Cisco devices, then this is a concept that's familiar. The routing table allows us to see our neighboring routes, or in other words, the ways that we get to other places on the network. So in this case, you see that we have a default gateway 192.168.0.1. The default gateway is the IP address, or the interface in other words, of the other device that all of our traffic has to pass through eventually if we want to get out to the public internet or to other external networks. That's a helpful information to have. And this IP address very likely is a router on the network. And when we're gathering intel, that's an essential information to have. Now, another frequently used command is the ping command. This command is available on virtually every operating system that has network connectivity. There's a high chance that you might be familiar with this one as well. The ping command is going to send data packets to an IP address that we decide on the network, and then it's going to report whether or not a response is received along with the amount of time that it took to transmit and receive that response. For an example, if I ping our default gateway 192.168.0.1 and I hit enter, this will continue to run indefinitely until I use something like Ctrl-Z to break out of there. Or we can also use Ctrl-C to break out of that as well. You can see the packet size for all of these is listed as 64 bytes. Each one of those ping attempts was a 64 bytes packet. You can also see a sequence number listed here, ICMP sequence number 1, 2, and that continues to increment as it continues to attempt that. We see that this response came from 192.168.0.1. We also see something called the TTL. The TTL stands for time to leave value. Each time this packet passes through a different network interface, that TTL value has 1 subtracted from it. In other words, it is decremented by 1. And once that reaches 0, the packet is going to stop. This is just a way to keep that packet from bouncing around indefinitely in a network in case something goes wrong. And of course, we also see our response time listed here, which is listed in milliseconds. And in this case, it's very low because we are directly connected to this default gateway. We can also use the traceroute command. If we say traceroute, we use the exact same IP address and we hit enter. This is going to go out to the IP address that we've indicated, and then it's going to return a list of other IP addresses through which we had to travel in order to get to that destination. Now in my case again, that's only a single entry because I'm directly connected to that. But if you're in a corporate network, in a corporate environment, this could be a much larger list, depending on how that network is laid out, and that can give you some really great intel about how the network is connected. Another great one is the ARP command. ARP standing for Address Resolution Protocol. That's a cornerstone concept in networking. This basically correlates a machine's IP address with a MAC address. Remember, we saw both of those addresses in the ifconfig output and also in the IPA output. So if we think about the ping command that we previously ran, the IP address of 192.168.0.1 we used was translated into a MAC address using the ARP table. So this is the second table here. In addition to the routing table, this is the ARP table. And this can also be helpful if we are trying to discover intel about a particular device. So let's say ARP-A, and that is going to give us a list of every other machine on this network that this particular machine has knowledge about. Or in other words, every IP address with which we've communicated will be listed in this ARP table along with the corresponding MAC address. And so what we can do here, in order to gather some intel, we can actually highlight this MAC address. We can copy that, and I'm going to jump into a web browser here, and we'll do a quick search for MAC address lookup. There are lots of different MAC address lookup tools out there. I typically use this Wireshark lookup tool or ouilookup.com. What we can do here is in this OUI search, we can go ahead and paste in this MAC address, this hardware MAC address, then click find. And near the bottom, you will see that this tells me that whatever hardware device this is, it is a Ubiquiti Networks device, which is in fact the exact type of router that I use. So this can be super helpful. If you are actively looking for a vendor-specific exploit or a security hole, it's a great way to find information. We're gathering intelligence. So we now know that this network uses a Ubiquiti device. We can therefore start to research any exploits in that regard. Let's go back to our terminal. And one last command that I'll mention here is netstart. Netstart being short for network statistics. If I hit enter, this is going to display information about open sockets and connection information on this machine. So basically, we're getting a look at any sort of active connections that we have on this machine. Where this is really useful in regard to penetration testing is that we can see certain ports that might be an entry point for us. Maybe there's an SSH port that's actively open that might get us into the system. So it's very helpful for us to be aware of this. I wanted to give you a brief introduction into some of the most useful and common network commands from the perspective of Linux, which you will surely need going forward.